Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our Chats with Emily. That's what we're calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition, and we now come to poem 249, Wild Nights. Wild Nights. When I began to talk about doing this series and calling it Chats with Emily, I had a close colleague who knows Emily well that asked me, what will you do with poem 249, Wild Nights, Wild Nights? Of course, she understood what she was asking. There are few poems in the whole collection of the 1,775 poems in the Johnson edition. As, can I say controversial? I will. I'll say controversial, although I really like better the word challenging. And this was right from the start. In the Johnson edition, where he gives a lot of background information about the poetry itself, this poem comes for special observation with a note. When Miss Todd and Colonel Hitchinson, the two who were seeking to select poems for publishing, were putting together the volume that would ultimately find certain of Emily's poems published, Higginson himself did feel some reservation about including this poem. He actually wrote to Miss Todd on the 21st of April, 1891, and he said this, quote, and this will obviously set us up for the study of this poem. One poem only I dread a little to print, that wonderful Wild Nights, lest the malignant read into it more than that virgin recluse ever dreamed of putting there. Has Miss Lavinia any shrinking about it? You will understand and pardon my solicitude. Yet, what a loss to omit it. Indeed, it is not to be omitted. We're, of course, grateful that it wasn't omitted. And we look now to this poem, Wild Nights, and we will see, really in some ways, Emily at her masterful best. I mean, we have said this already about several of the poems that we've studied together, and our assumptions are that you have been working with me. Again, learnstrong.net, Chats with Emily, our playlist, and down that left-hand side. And if you've been working with us, and I hope that you have, you've already worked through our set of introductory comments. I'm hopeful that you've worked through the preceding 248 poems. We just finished with Why Do They Shut Me Out of Heaven? And here we are going to play around with so many scholars' observations. The great scholar David Priest will point out that Emily will talk about the sea of love throughout her life. Kate Anthon, she wrote in a letter 209 of 1859, she said, quote, this is again Emily, I am pleasantly located in the deep sea, but love will row you out if her hands are strong, end quote. Otis P. Lord, in a letter that she wrote to him, letter 559 of 1879, quote, the exultation floods me, I cannot find my channel, the creek turns sea at thought of thee, end quote. She also says in letter 332 of 1869 to a cousin that, quote, dying is a wild night and a new road. So much so that Ruth Miller will interpret this poem as expressing a longing for Christ and heaven, and not the erotic interpretation that's often given to this poem. Now, it is interesting that Emily said in a letter 268 of July 1862 to Thomas Higginson, the very Higginson we were just referencing, quote, when I state myself as the representative of the verse, it does not mean me, but a supposed person. And in that regards, we find ourselves looking at a poem like this, wondering, what exactly is it that's going on? Are we talking about Sam Boyles as we reference Eden? Sam Boyles himself, in a letter to Sue in Austin, had written about his rowing experiences off the Maine coast from a vacation place at Eden. And it may be that Emily is playing that game as well. Now, this is, some will argue, one of Emily's most erotic poems, or maybe one of her most religious poems. This poem might be read differently today than certainly when it was published. And Emily's earthquake style, as one scholar has called it, is now at play. And I said this when I did my series, Talks with Walt, at learnstrong.net, and we did all the poems of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. I said back then, I think Whitman was having so much fun in so many of the poems that he was writing, and I'm certainly convinced Emily was doing the exact same thing. And why we call this series Chats with Emily is it would be so much fun to sit down with her, even if she has to sit on the other side of the door, as she often did at the end of her life, so that she didn't see. I mean, think of the power of this supposed reclusive woman that will write a poem like Wild Nights, Wild Nights. And we would ask her, when you wrote this poem, A, who were you writing it to and for? And B, what were you thinking when you were generating the level of energy that is here? Now, many have pointed out that we really have a couple of rhymed couplets, even though in the first stanza it's broken up into 4 lines. Let's enjoy the poem, shall we? Wild nights, were I with thee. Wild nights should be our luxury. Futile the winds to a heart in port, done with the compass, done with the chart. Rowing in Eden, the sea, my eye but moor tonight in thee. Now, the poem again is majestic in its ability, and we've said this so many times about Emily's work. This is what makes her genius. To make the reader immediately go, who are we talking about when we speak about thee? Who is this poem directed at? Is it directed at Sue? Is it directed at Sam Boyles? Is it directed at God? I mean, to what degree is she channeling the kind of mystical types of language and poetry she was familiar with in the Christian tradition, where there's a certain kind of aesthetic tendency? Or is she just outright being unbelievably erotic here? Notice it is not with thee at the very last line, but in thee. There's all kinds of interesting switching in regards to the whole notion of erotic poetry, as she's almost a male speaker here speaking to a female speaker. What is going on here? Is this homoerotica? There's so many ways to read this poem, and of course all of them have been read. And instead of taking sides here, what we just simply want to do is enjoy the poem. Notice the trinities of this poem. She will say it twice in the first line and then to the third line. Wild nights. Now you'll remember wild from poem 179, only to break in wilder song. So she loves this word wild, right? As in, just released in some powerful way. And again, notice it's not day, it's nights. It would be wild nights, notice twice, were I with thee. Okay, so who is the thee? Notice right away, we're getting already for the word futile. There is a reading of this poem that says, no, this poem is not a celebration at all of wild nights, but rather a recognition, I don't get to have wild nights. I wish that I could. I long for it, and in fact, there seems to be a solicitation at the end. Might I? Boy, I would love to be, in thee. And then I would have the wild nights. Wild nights should be our luxury. Now, of course, luxury can be understood as any number of things, back to even the banking language or the economic language that she loves. But here, I think it's probably more interpreted today, anyway, as luxury is lust. And then there's this word futile, which the idea of, in another poem, she'll call it a futile diadem. Futile. This may be the key word of the poem. If you read the poem as not getting what we want, now all of a sudden we're in the same tradition of a number of the poems that we've read. I just wish that I could have the thing I long for. Go back and look, of course, at poem 248, for example, right? Notice, the winds are futile to a heart in port. And again, notice it's not a soul, but it's a heart. Done, and then we're going to get 2 dones. Done with the compass, done with the chart. Reminds us of Walt Whitman's Song of the Open Road. Done with indoor complaints, libraries, querulous criticisms, afoot and lighthearted, I take to the open road. In other words, there are certain things I'm done with. The compass, the chart, suggests that there's things I don't need. If only I could be with you. I would transcend all those other things. Now, if you're reading this as a religious poem, the compass and the chart might be, of course, the orthodoxy and the biblical orthodoxy of the Christianity she's raised with. And I don't think it's too far away to say Milton is clearly standing as well behind much of this poem. Rowing in Eden. Now, of course, we know that she often would reference Eden and Sue. Hey, do you remember poem 4? We'll just go back and remember. On this one, poem 4, on this wondrous sea, sailing silently, ho, pilot, ho, knowest thou the shore where no breakers roar, where the storm is o'er, in the peaceful west, many the sails at rest, the anchors fast, thither I pilot thee, land, ho, eternity, ashore at last. What about poem 52? Do you remember when we played the game of poem 52? Whether my bark went down at sea, whether she met with gales, whether to isles enchanted she bent her docile sails, by what mystic mooring she is held today, this is the errand of the eye out up on the bay. And then finally, do you remember when we did poem 211? And this is the way that she said it. Come slowly, Eden, lips unused to thee, bashful, sip thy jasmines as the fainting bee, reaching late his flower round her chamber hums, counts his nectars, enters, and is lost in balms. This is why it's fascinating to read all of the poems of Emily Dickinson, because you start to get a sense of the ways in which, oh yes, she's been playing around with many of these images, rowing in Eden. Now, obviously, there's ironies here because we didn't have a sea in Eden, of course. We only have a river flowing out of Eden. Emily's audience would obviously immediately know this. And then she'll use this formation of the as we've seen already in several poems. Is it erotic kind of sighing here? Or is it the alas of T.S. Eliot's hollow men? We are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw. Alas, our dry voices, when we whisper are quiet and meaningless here. This how do you read it? The sea. Now, the brilliant scholar Judith Farr will point out that the sea is often referencing that primal sexual waters. The sea, my eye but moor tonight. Notice the immediacy of this poem. In thee. Now, when we get to poem 453, we're going to play around powerfully one more time with that one, and it will read like this. And we'll come back to this poem. We'll come back to this poem a number of times when we play this game. 453. It reads like this: Love, thou art high, I cannot climb thee. But were it two, who knows but we, taking turns at the chimbrazu, docile at last, stand up by thee. Love, thou art deep, I cannot cross thee. But were there two instead of one, rower and yacht, some sovereign summer, who knows but we'd reach the sun. Love, thou art veiled, a few behold thee, smile and alter and prattle and die. Bliss were an oddity without thee, nicknamed by God eternity. Okay, so how are we going to report at 2A the message or theme of this poem? There's so many of them. I think one easy, obvious one is we all long to be with the one that we love. At 2B, the contrasts here are amazing between, of course, the wildness and the serenity, and the three sets of rhyming couplets to set this up. I think, though, that word futile is a significant word because there's a longing in this poem that I think is often overlooked because of the exhilarative nature of Wild Nights, Wild Nights. At 3A, Farr has pointed out, the scholar in The Passion of Emily Dickinson, that Thomas Cole, the founder of the Hudson River School, and his paintings, Garden of Eden, the 1828 offering, as well as Expulsion from Eden, in her book she does a masterful job of explaining how really you need to understand those pieces of art to be able to really read closely a poem like this. Bronte's Wuthering Heights is often referenced in association, and then obviously Milton's Paradise Lost and the prelapsarian sex that's described there. We've given full lectures on Paradise Lost at learnstrong.net. Finally, at 3B, how do you own a poem like this? What was a time when you longed to be with the one that you cared for, and the word futile kept coming back? Oh, if only you could have those wild nights. I hope that you're enjoying reading Emily's stuff as wild. Thank you.